Today I'm going to share two chapters of Tartarian Tales. So they are the following two chapters after the Tartar King, which is Tartarian Tales 15. So here we go, and I wanted to really share this other thing with you as well in a second, because with the last video I was talking about language and how similar it was and seemed to like a lot of the X's and ways that like Quetzalcoatl's and all those kind of Mayan Aztec myths say. And so I came across this in one of the books, Ambassador's Travels into, I forget, I think it was Greenland and a few other things, but it had some words that were Tartar language from I-636 or 1636 that were kind of interesting, so I just wanted to share. You guys can take a look at them. They seem a little different here, and like I imagine, there's different dialects of Tartarian, like there is of everything. You know, different states require different things. But the ones from this video that I'm about to read and this Tartar King seem very South American, Aztec, and Mayan. So just take with it what you will. Who knows the truth? Hopefully we'll find out someday and piece something together. But here we go. Two chapters, starting with the Tartars lift the siege. Since our arrival at this camp 43 days before, there were a few battles and skirmishes between the besiegers and the besieged, as well as two assaults with scaling ladders, which the defenders inside the walls resisted bravely, determined not to give ground. When he saw that this campaign, on which he had spent so much of his resources, had turned out to be quite the opposite of what he had expected, the Tartar king put the matter before a general council, attended by all of the 27 kings who had accompanied him, as well as many princes and lords and most of the captains. Therein was agreed that he had no alternative but to lift the siege and depart before winter set in completely, and that any further delay would mean total disaster in view of the fact that winter was already upon them, the fields were already beginning to flood, both rivers were rising rapidly and running with such great force and pressure that they had already washed out most of the trenches and earthworks throughout the camp, and many of the men had already died of disease, which was spreading so widely that not a day passed without 4,000 to 5,000 men dying, and the shortage of food was becoming so acute that the captains did not have enough to supply the daily rations, nor were the horses, which they were allotted for that purpose, sufficient to take care of even half of the rabble. The king held all these reasons to be sound, and decided to follow their advice, much against his will, because he understood that it was necessary to do so. He immediately had all the foot soldiers embark with all the munitions in the campgrounds put to the torch, and he departed overland with only 300,000 cavalry and a train of 20,000 yak. A casualty count made in accordance with the captain's rolls showed that 450,000 men had died, most of them from sickness, and that 300,000 horses and 60,000 yak had been eaten in the 2.5 months of famine they endured. This meant that out of the 1,800,000 men with whom he had started out from his kingdom to lay siege to the city of Peking, which had lasted for 6.5 months, he was leaving with an army reduced by 750,000, with 450,000 having died of the pestilence, hunger, and war, and 300,000 having passed over to the ranks of the Chinese, attracted by higher pay and the many other advantages they received in the form of honors and cash bonuses, which were showered on them continuously. And there is nothing surprising about this, for experience has taught us that this alone has much more power than anything else on earth to compel a man to do something. Wow, the same thing is happening today. Okay, back to Tartarian. Having departed from the city of Peking on a Monday, October 17, with only 300,000 cavalrymen, as I said before, out of the 600,000 he had originally brought with him, that same day, close to nightfall, the Tartar king encamped beside a river called Quetragum, and on the following day, an hour before sunrise, to the beat of many fifes and drums, as well as many other kinds of martial instruments they ordinarily use, the camp fell into the order assigned to them, sending lookouts and scouts ahead and organizing the captains of the vanguard and tuiguaxes, which is a different kind of armed unit they usually place in the rear, behind the baggage train and the service troops, a tactic which affords greater protection to an army on the march than we normally have. Marching in this order, he arrived close to vesper time at a city called Guijampe, which he found completely deserted. After he had rested for an hour and a half, which was the length of time he usually allowed, he broke camp and resumed the march at full speed, and encamped for the night at the foot of a mountain range called Liempu, from which he also departed at the start of the dawn watch. He marched in this order for 17 days, covering 8 leagues per day, and at the end of that time he reached a fair city by the name of Guaxatizen, with a population of 10 or 12,000, where he was advised to replenish his store of provisions because by then he was running low. With that end in view, the city was attacked on all sides with scaling ladders, and since the resistance encountered from within was weak, in very little time it was entered and put to the sack, with such cruel havoc visited on the miserable inhabitants of the city that all of us 9 companions went about in a state of shock. After everything had been consumed and razed to the ground both by fire and sword, and the camp had been plentifully supplied with many good stocks of provisions, he departed, setting forth at an hour before daybreak. The following day, passing within sight of the city of Cake Silo, he refused to attack it since it was big and strong, not only because it was learned that there were 50,000 men inside, including 10,000 Moguls, Co-Chinese, and Chams, people who are more resolute and experienced in warfare than the Chinese. Passing on from here, he arrived at the walls of Singrachirao, which are the ones that I said before divide these 2 empires of China and Tartary. Since he did not encounter any resistance there, he went on to make camp on the other side in Panquinor, which was the first city within his territory, located 3 leagues from this Singrachirao wall, and on the following day he reached Xipator, where he demobilized his army. Staying here only 7 days, during which he took care of the business of satisfying obligations, paying wages, and executing justice upon some of the prisoners they had brought along, he embarked unencumbered, but none too happy, and went on his way to Lankame, taking only 120 oar-propelled lollies with him, capable of carrying 10 to 12,000 men, on which 6 days later he arrived in the city of Lankame, where, without wanting any reception or celebration to be arranged in his honor, he disembarked at 2 hours after dark. So these Tartars were pretty brutal. Imagine just waking up and being like, oh wow, there's an army coming through here, and then all of a sudden your entire town is destroyed. That seems to be the way things work during this time, whenever this was. I-5 something, 15 something, on a different timeline, AD, BC, something totally different. Who knows? Could be who knows what time this takes place in. It seems so ancient and bizarre and weird. But here we go. We're going to keep going with the next chapter. At the Tartar court, the king waited in the city of Lankame for all his troops, both the infantry and the cavalry, to catch up with him, which delayed him for 26 days. As soon as he had them all gathered together, he departed for another much larger and more magnificent city called Tuimacau, where he was greeted in person by some princes from neighboring states, as well as by the ambassadors of other kings and lords from more remote areas, the most important of whom were 6 very great and powerful rulers, namely the Shah Tahmasp, king of the Persians, the Sayman, emperor of the Gugos, whose lands border in the interior on the Burmese kingdom of Tungu, the Kalaminha, lord of the indomitable force of the elephants of the earth, as will be explained when I discuss him and his dominions further on, the Sornau of Ayutthaya, known as the king of Siam, whose domain extends for 700 leagues from Tenasserim to Champa, bordering along the coast on the lands of the Malays, Berdios, and Pathans, and in the interior of Pitsanulok, Kampangempet, Chiang Mai, Laos, and the lands of the Gugos. Thus he has a total of 17 kingdoms in his domain alone, where he goes by the supreme title among all these heathens of Lord of the White Elephant. Yet another was the king of the Moguls, whose kingdom and sovereignty lies in the interior between the Khorasan, which is next to Persia, and the kingdom of Delhi and Chitor, and an emperor called the Karao, whose domain, from what we learned here, borders within the mountains of Gongkalidao at above 60 degrees, on a people whom the natives here call Muscovy, some of whom we saw in this city. They are tall, red-headed men, who go dressed in breeches, cassocks, and hats, after the fashion of the Flemish and Germans whom we see here in Portugal. The most honorable among them were wearing long, fur-lined robes, some with fine marten skins, and were carrying long, broad swords. We detected some Latin words in the language they spoke, and when they sneezed they would say, Dominus, 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 3 times. But everything else about them, from what we observed, looked more idolatry and paganism than true religion, and above all, they were much inclined to the unspeakable sin. The ambassador of the Karao prince was given a much better reception than all the others. He brought with him a retinue of 120 bodyguards armed with arrows and panuras inlaid with gold and silver. all of them attired in dressed leather dyed purple and green, 12 mounted mace bearers with silver staffs, 12 spare horses all decked out in crimson trappings, trimmed all over with laces interwoven with gold and silver threads, and 12 gigantic men of the most unaccustomed stature dressed in huge tiger-skin garments, the way savages are usually depicted, each with a large greyhound of his own, all of them restrained with silver chains and muzzles made of silver, with many little bells also made of silver attached to them, like horses' headstalls. These muzzles, which they wore to keep them from biting, were locked into some brass rings with their gilded guards like those of a bridle bit, and there were 12 little boys mounted on white horses, riding in stiff-legged style, on green velvet saddles covered with silk netting, all of them dressed alike in short robes of purple satin lined with marten skins, with matching breeches and hats, and very heavy gold chains strung across their chests like baldricks. They were all of equal size, and in my entire life I have never seen such handsome features and fine, well-proportioned bodies as theirs, for not one of them showed the slightest defect of nature with which one could find fault, and those were all the people he had with him in the mounted portion of his retinue. He himself rode in a carriage with 3 wheels on each side that was completely trimmed with silver, and in it was a silver chair on which he was seated. Around the pirange, as this carriage was called, were 40 footmen, handsomely attired in leather doublets and checkered green and purple cloth hosed with red silk lace and buckled shoes very much like the old-fashioned Portuguese style. They were carrying swords more than 3 fingers wide, with silver pommels, grips, and chapes, and hunting horns hanging crisscross from their shoulders on chains that were also made of silver, and on their heads they wore some sort of helmets like shepherd hoods, with many feathers on them, lavishly decorated with silver trimmings. All in all, the pomp and splendor displayed by this ambassador, whose name is Lexigau, was of such grandeur and majesty that one could immediately tell that he represented a very rich and powerful prince. In the apartments where he stayed, which we went to see one day in the company of Mitaker, who paid him a visit on behalf of the king, among the other things we saw, which we noted particularly because they were the most unusual and rarest of all in that country, were 5 apartments decorated with wall hangings of very richly wrought Arras tapestries, like the ones we use, from which it appears that the ones they use are manufactured in the same place as the ones that come to Portugal. In each of these 5 apartments there was a brocade canopy hanging over a tent with a silver bowl and pitcher on it, of very costly workmanship, a crimson chair of state decorated with gold and purple fringes, and a matching foot cushion to go with it. In certain parts the floor was covered with large carpets, and there was a silvery brazier containing an incense burner, also made of silver, that gave off an extremely pleasant fragrance. Standing at the door of each one of these 5 apartments were 2 halberdiers, who made no attempt to bar the entrance to any noble person wishing to see it. In another very large room that, somewhat like a veranda, ran across the entire street front and also furnished like the other apartments, there was a table on a tall raised platform, set like ours with damask tablecloths and another matching cloth on top of it, both fringed in gold, as well as a napkin on a silver salver with a gold spoon and fork, and 2 small salt cellars, likewise of gold. About 10 or 12 paces from this table there were 2 sideboards, fully laden with very fine silver plate, with a great quantity of pieces of every size and shape, fashioned by lathe. In the 4 corners of this apartment there were 4 large earthenware jars, each with a capacity of nearly a quart, with their little warming pans attached by chains adorned in sections with pieces of gilded material of some sort as thick as a man's arm, and 2 enormous candlesticks, with their fresh candles unlit because it was still daylight. At the door of this gallery there were 12 halberdiers standing smartly at attention, dressed in a very shaggy homespun, with matching hoods on their heads and short silver-plated swords in their belts, who answered in such a rude and arrogant manner when spoken to that everyone was afraid of them. This ambassador, in addition to the official visit he came to pay, as did the others, also came to treat of a marriage between the Carrau emperor and one of the Tartars' sisters named Mica Vidau, meaning splendid sapphire, a woman who was already 30 years of age but very attractive and very charitable to the poor, whom she helped for the love of God. We saw her frequently in the city at important festivals that these people are accustomed to observing on set days of the year, which they celebrate with many pastimes and a great deal of merrymaking, albeit in the heathen style, in keeping with all their customs. But putting all this aside for the moment, which I only brought up in order to give an account of the ambassadors that we saw at this court, especially this last one, who I thought was more noteworthy than all the others, I will return to the subject I was dealing with, not only with regard to our freedom, but also the route we took to the islands of the China Sea, where this king or emperor of Tartary arranged for us to be sent, so that men in this part of Europe may be informed about a few things they may never have heard of before. And that's exactly what he's doing, and he's still doing it to this day. I love that this guy's mission to keep this information preserved and get it out there in the public is still existing today, however many, whether it's hundreds of years later or thousands. It's just amazing. These stories have such great detail. They're written so beautifully. It's so fascinating. I hope you all are liking it as much as I am, because I've got much more to share, and let's see what comes next. You never know. Bless you all.